Today is another product launch day, and actually we have another wave of CPUs coming from AMD at some point here in the near future. So ask the wife, we've been super busy with benchmarking. Today though, we've got the 5900X and the 5800X. This one here is the 12-core 24-thread variant, and this one here is the 8-core 16-thread variant. So this is more in line with like a modern Intel Core i7, and this one is just a bit beefier than a Core i9. Now don't get me wrong, these chips, they really need to impress. I mean, how much better can things really get on the same, or what is essentially the same 7nm process from TSMC? Well, if you haven't already, be sure to check out our previous video, which breaks down the key component of Zen 3 architecture that sharply reduces core-to-core memory latencies. Two key factors, core-to-core latency and memory latency, that many games rely on. So it's important that we stress that going into this, because you're going to be impressed. And if AMD can do just that, again, steal the gaming crown from Intel, who's been basically grasping at straws at this point to keep it in its corner, then I'd say this is a huge win for Zen 3, and then at that point we just need to discuss price. So let's get started. Stay with me. This video is brought to you by Ridge Wallet, a sleek, light, and compact solution for buggy, unorganized messes. Fellas, be honest, does your wallet look anything like this right here? Ridge Wallets hold up to 12 cards plus room for cash. You can choose between over 30 styles and enjoy a durable build backed by a lifetime warranty and peace of mind thanks to RFID blocking tech baked in. My favorite designs are these two right here, the carbon fiber model and the forged carbon model. This one's especially cool, and you can find both via the link below. Just visit ridge.com/GS and use code GS for 10% off with free worldwide shipping and returns. That's ridge.com/GS and use code GS. So without rehashing all the details we've already discussed in previous videos, you should know that our test bench for every CPU you're about to see tested has remained exactly the same, save the obvious necessities, the obvious differences in motherboards. So we went with a Z490 motherboard for our Intel platform, and then we went with a B550 motherboard for our AMD platform. We updated to the latest available BIOS. I should note that AMD did not want us testing, at least out of the gate, with a B550 board. They intentionally directed us to one of the 4 or 5, big boards from the manufacturers like ASRock, Gigabyte, and ASUS. I don't think I have one of those on hand to test with. And I figured, all right, well, B550 seems like a pretty promising chipset. I think a lot of people are going to be upgrading to something like that because it's just a bit more affordable than X570. You don't have that chipset fan either, which is super annoying, even though you can usually tweak it in the BIOS. So B550 it is. Keep that in the back of your head. That might slightly change a few things, and I'll get back to power and BIOS settings in a second, but I do also want to stress that we used a 2080 Ti from MSI as our graphics card. Of course, that's going to remain the same throughout all of our tests. The cooler was a Noctua NHU12A, and we used a Carbonaut pad from Thermal Grizzly to make sure that there weren't any variances in how thermal paste otherwise would have been applied. So carbon pads are typically going to perform about on par, maybe slightly worse than traditional thermal compound, certainly not as good as premium thermal paste, but this allows us to keep testing consistent because we do have CPU thermals to show you as well, which is again going to vary from chip to chip, but you get an idea of where things fall in line. And of course, I encourage everyone to watch more than just 1 or 2 reviews, or to read 1 or 2 reviews. You want to read more than that, you want to watch more than that. I expect other tech YouTubers and websites pair their CPUs with different platforms and different graphics cards, both of which, as I'm sure you all know, can have substantial impacts on how these CPUs perform. So feel free to pause this video for a closer look at our specs. Every CPU in this list was measured at stock conditions with Precision Boost enabled for AMD and MCE disabled for Intel. Now, MCE, or multi-core enhancement, pushes Intel CPUs far beyond stock TDP levels for long durations, that's the key distinction, by heavily modifying voltages, whereas PB allows for temporary boost spikes within acceptable windows of elevated power draw. So in essence, one is like a factory sanctioned overclock, so to speak, and the other falls more in line with like turbo boost from Intel. It's about as clean, cut and dry as I can describe that to you without elaborating. And you'll see this reflected here in our power draw and temperature chart. So under an IDA64 load for the cores, cache, and FPUs, our 5800X review sample pulled 112 watts at its peak This is with PB enabled, while our 5900X pulled around 140. Now contrast this with Intel offerings like the 10900K, which already pulls 210 watts alone with MCE disabled, which in case you're wondering, shot up to 100 degrees Celsius with our Noctua NA212A after about 5 seconds of running the same stress test with MCE enabled. And yeah, this is why we leave it unselected. Now moving on to our Cinebench R20 scores. We reveal here a major upset in single core performance. Both our Zen 3 chips absolutely demolish Intel competitors. I mean, look, this is night and day in my opinion. 616 and 622 versus what, 530 or so for the Core i9. And granted, this is a stock Core i9, but still, these frequencies get up pretty high even at stock amongst a single core especially. And I'm kind of in shock. It hasn't fully set in yet. I mean, this is a massive leap. I don't even think I could hit 620 on a single core if I manually overclocked my 10900K sample. So that's saying something. Power draw and temps aside, it's a pretty phenomenal feat. So AMD's doing pretty good so far, but will this translate across the board? That's the big question. Traditionally, that answer is no, but we'll see anyway. Geekbench 5 is up next, which contains a cluster of CPU-intensive tasks, and well, we see our Zen 3 chips still dominating the competition across the board. I mean, heck, even on our multi-core side, right? Look at the 5800X, which only has 8 cores, mind you. It's outperforming our 10900K, which has 10 cores. Right? That's how big of an efficiency gap Zen 3 has bridged here. But now on to 3D Mark. In TimeSpy, which is a 1440p DX12 synthetic, the 58 and 5900X actually lose to the 10900K in our physics test, which ended up affecting our overall score as well. And I reran these benchmarks several times to ensure nothing strange was taking place, maybe like a random background process popped up. That's why you want to run multiple times. But sure enough, Intel is still favored here when paired with the exact same graphics card. But how about actual games? Maybe Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Look, AMD actually showcased this one in its Zen 3 keynote, so I was keen to test things similar to how they had. I'm not sure exactly what platform they used, exactly what in-game settings they used, but I actually found, coincidentally, fairly similar frame rates for my 5800X and 5900X samples. My 3900X actually ended up doing quite a bit better than they revealed, but again, I'm not exactly sure how things were run. The small delta between Zen 2 and 10th gen Intel, however, has been closed with the release of Zen 3, and AMD is now on par with Intel in this title. What do you know? F1 2020 in DX12 is up next. Here, both 5000 series processors clearly dominate the competition, 232 FPS on average in 1080p. That's the high preset with a dab of anti-aliasing, I think TAA. And this is 15 FPS more than the 10900K. And this is a title that the 10900K has been dominating in. And I feel like I'm kind of dreaming here. I mean, I don't know. I suppose it's not too big a surprise when you look at the 19% touted IPC uplift. And look, your previous generation was already occasionally trading blows with Team Blue. So I suppose you should be on top in some of these titles, but it's great to see. And I mean, sure, like 1% lows if I'm really being picky here. Those were a bit lower than I would have liked, but nothing too alarming and something that could possibly be tweaked in software over time. But just on the surface, especially in the averages, Zen 3's looking mighty fine. Now let's take a look at an older title, GTA 5. I like to test this one mainly because it tends to be fairly Intel biased. So if AMD can at least match Intel here, I'd say this is a win. So in 1080p high settings with no anti-aliasing, we're seeing quite a bit of leverage offloaded to the CPU, although the usages, or the overall usage wouldn't suggest this. But when compared side by side, you can see just how close things are between AMD and Intel. I'm pleasantly surprised by how well the 5800X in particular does here. It keeps up with a 10-core Intel counterpart and even narrowly beats the 9900KS in both averages and 1% lows. And remember, the 9900KS in this group of CPUs boosts to 5 gigahertz across all 8 cores stock. So this is essentially a factory overclocked chip to begin with. So this is pretty huge. Ashes of a Singularity is up next, and I know this one isn't a particularly popular title. I actually think it's more popular among benchmarkers than actual gamers. It's just more of a reviewer's title, but these margins are worth noting. AMD loses just slightly here, but they've closed the gap that existed with Zen 2. I'm not sure if this was a title that was tested. I feel like off the top of my head it was. I'm not sure how they presented it, but in my testing, in 1080p, again, high preset, the AMD Zen 3 chips slightly fell behind. Nothing too alarming, I would say. But the opposing argument in this case is also worth mentioning. Keep in mind the fact that this 10700K is actually a decent, I don't want to say fair, I think it's a disservice to this chip. It's actually a pretty decent value if you can find it for around 350 bucks. And in respect to this title, again, the 10700K looks like the better value. You're actually getting still 8 cores, you're getting 16 threads, you're getting overclocking support, albeit with a Zen 3 series motherboard only, but still. Keep chips like these in the back of your mind when scrubbing through these graphs, because performance is very game dependent, and the prices of these CPUs, especially bearing in mind that Zen 3 costs a bit more than Zen 2 and Zen Plus, and heck, even the original Zen chips did, is potentially the one, problem with this launch. I don't want to jump to conclusions just yet, but Zen 3 is not destroying Intel in any of these gaming benchmarks. I mean, F1 2020 is the exception, but you're already at super high frame rates. And at that point, if you're going to be, buying a $500 or $600 CPU, I highly doubt you're going to be playing in 1080p. I mean, maybe you're playing a super competitive title like CS:GO, and 1080p is where it's at, a smaller display. I get it, right? That's what pros do, but a lot of people buying these chips, I feel like, are going to be going for at least 1440p. That's going to offload a bit more of the the utilization, I should say, to the graphics card. And if you get a beefy graphics card like a 2080, 2080 Ti, or heck, even a new Ampere card, I don't think it's gonna matter which CPU you go with, because the graphics card is gonna be stressed more than anything. At which point, these chips aren't looking as good. They're not looking as good for gaming. But productivity, definitely where these things excel. So interesting observation, I guess, from the graphs. I'm sure some of you are looking at the graphs thinking, how on earth did you come to that conclusion? But I think where the real value for gaming is going to be is in the 6-core variant of Zen 3. Just because 6 cores, 12 threads tends to be the sweet spot for most gamers. Now you want to talk about streaming, that's another story, and we have a dedicated video coming about that. But I keep picking up this one thinking it's the 5800X. This one, the 5800X, or whatever other cheaper variant of the Ryzen 7 5000 series chip comes out, will be more than likely, at least this is traditionally how it's been, the best for a streamer, content creator, because you've got those extra cores at your disposal. Not that you couldn't already do that with a 6-core variant, but just a bit more CPU headroom at your disposal. Now, the last game I tested was just for the lulz, but it was Planet Coaster. I downloaded a super detailed map from the Steam workshop and rode one of the coasters in that map in POV, actually. So I was recording the frame rate along the way from start to finish. And now, obviously, something like 30 FPS is absolute trash for a system like this, but certain games using certain engines will only favor a few cores. They will only utilize a few cores. Heck, look at our GPU utilizations. It's super low, but so is our CPU utilization. So you know there's a bottleneck somewhere, and in this case, it is definitely in the CPU, because we're only testing things at 1080p and in the high preset. We're not even in the ultra preset here. And in situations like this, it's gonna come down to IPC and sheer clock speed over anything else. And we see that play out here, right? The 5900X looks rather appealing in this light. I mean, pulling 30 FPS while the 9900KS, for example, struggles to hit just below that. This is at lower frame rates, this is a 10% delta or thereabouts, right? Whereas if it was a 3 FPS difference at 200 FPS, right, that's a much smaller percentage. You're a lot less likely to perceive that difference. But potentially the difference between 25 and 30, you can notice. I have a trained eye doing what I do, filming and the like. I can tell the difference between 24 and 30 FPS. I imagine most probably could if they were told to, that one was a lower frame rate than the other. But the untrained eye might not notice the difference. Just a lot easier to do at a lower frame rate than when you're at 100 or 200 FPS, which is again why I wanted to show a title like this. It's just crazily unoptimized for a platform this powerful. So let's spend a bit of time then talking about price. It's going to be a talking head segment of the video. You can minimize the screen if you want. You don't have to look at me. But to be honest, things are a bit less competitive in certain respects than I had initially thought. Case in point, the 5900X has 2 extra cores than the 10900K, and it also happens to be quite a bit more efficient, right? But it costs an additional 50 bucks, at least on paper. Now, you're probably not gonna find a 10900K at MSRP, but still, you're not even getting a stock cooler here. So that argument's out the window for AMD fans. The only difference at this point is availability. I get that. The platform support, I get that, but the platform support is pretty much ending with this generation here as far as I'm concerned. And then the IGP, which is a very niche use case, but still, you have the IGP in the 10900K unless you're buying the F SKU. You don't have an IGP here. And again, remember, I want to stress this because this is something that I feel like is unfair to not point out. The 10900K at MSRP is super difficult to come by. Some reputable e-retailers have it marked up by 50 bucks or more. So when prices are apples to apples, the 5900K, in my opinion, is the better choice, hands down, period. But what about the 5800X? This one's a bit more peculiar because it's the first time a Ryzen-based 8-core chip, I'm pretty sure it's the first time, has dipped heavy into the $400 price range. You can find one for around maybe $450 at launch. I'd be surprised if these didn't sell out pretty fast, but you'll have a difficult choice ahead of you if you're kind of in the undecided pool, because the 10700K is readily available, at least as of time of filming, at around 375 bucks, and it's still an 8-core 16-thread overclockable chip with an IGP. I think where the real value exists is gonna be with the non-X SKU or the 5700 SKU, should that one ever see the light of day. I don't have any word of whether or not that exists. And look, this is no surprise really. We have a dedicated overclocking video coming for these two chips in particular, but most of us know that the real value is in the 700 and 600 marks CPUs from AMD. So the 5600 and the 5700, particularly the non-X SKUs, assuming they exist. These will be the ones to go after if you value, value. But look, as it stands, these chips will make for pretty awesome upgrades if you're only on, say, an original Zen CPU, or maybe even Zen Plus. I wouldn't consider upgrading from Zen 2 unless you're interested in making a substantial core count jump in the process, so something like a 3600 to a 3900X, possibly worth it there if your workload demands it, and assuming you can get some decent cash back for the resale of your 3600. But if you're already on, say, like a 3900X or even a 3800X, in my opinion, it doesn't really make sense to upgrade to a 58 or 5900X. I mean, the IPC improvements are definitely noticeable, but you'll be paying a bit of a premium for early adoption, no doubt, and you're unlikely to notice any substantial, I think it's a fair word, any substantial jump in gaming performance, because Zen 2, let's be real, was already pretty good. I mean, it was good enough for most people, give or take 5% off of Intel's marks in most titles. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I think that the last question then is, if you're thinking about upgrading, what motherboard do you have? If you're on B350 or X370, doesn't look like you're gonna get support. There might be BIOSes that roll out that allow support for it, but I don't really see that happening. I'd be happy if it did, so I'm certainly not against it. But at least as of right now, it's not officially supported. If you're already on B450 or X470 though, and you have, say, a 2600 or a 1600, that would be like the ripe area for an upgrade. So something like a 30, or not a 30, a 50, 800X would be decent, again, for the right workloads. Maybe you wanna wait a bit more, see if there's a 5700, something like that comes out. It'd be a bit better value, maybe dips just below $400. I think that would be the ultimate sweet spot for the all-around, the all-arounder, just the best at pretty much everything a consumer could possibly want to do. So with that, I keep sliding these things across the table. I don't know what to do with them. If you guys like the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments below what you want to see next. Again, we have the overclocking video coming, as well as kind of a unique video where we actually clock these CPUs all to 4 gigahertz across all whatever 8 or 12 cores. We're gonna do the same for the Intel chips, and we're gonna compare side by side just how much better Zen 3 is clock for clock. So there'll be a measurement of IPC, instructions per. So stay tuned for that, as well as that overclocking video. I think the 5900X is gonna be a pretty sweet overclocker. I kind of got that vibe. The core is actually boosted. Frequency was holding around 4.5 gigahertz when I was stressing an IDA64. I think it was 4.4, the lowest that any of the cores got, which is, it's better, right? It's better than Zen 2, but it's not that 4.8, 4.9 gig out-of-box all-core that some people were hoping for. So we'll see how that fares when it comes to manual overclocking. And yeah, some of the cheaper variants coming out as well. The 3600X is gonna be sent, I believe, this week or next week. We'll be sure to test that one out and yeah, give you guys the inside scoop. Thank you for watching. Again, comment, subscribe, leave a like, and I'll see you in the next one. My name is Greg. Thanks for learning with me.